Today I'm going to talk to you about I'm just going to give an overview of dramatic text and analysis. This is just to set us off for the beginning of the semester, and these are all terms and concepts and ideas that will be appearing on your midterm as well as your final. And so you need to get used to using these terms. And also, though, these are more than terms. What you're going to be learning about are methods that playwrights use in order to create effective plays. And so in our playwriting assignments that we do for the class, these terms and methods are going to be very useful. So let's just start. We'll start with, before we even go into it, I want to talk about the term character versus figure, because in this class, we're going to use the term figure the way you probably are used to using the word character. Usually when people say character and they're talking about a script, a movie, or a play, or a novel even, they use the word character to describe the fictitious people walking around and talking in the play. But in this class, we are going to use the term figure instead to talk about fictitious people, animals, or creatures that are being represented in play scripts. Character in this course is going to have more to do with the way Aristotle spoke about character, and that is each figure has a character, has a quality as a human being. They have a temperament. These are all parts of a figure's character, and those things are revealed through the figure's own words and actions. And it's also determined. A figure's character is determined by what other figures in the play say about them and what they do with them. And yet there are other ways of determining character, and one of those other ways is the way that character talks about and interacts with other people. So these are all ways that character is determined. So character is detail in a figure that's provided by a playwright or in performance by an actor. But we're going to refer to the figures, these figures, when we talk about fictitious beings in plays. Here is my justification for doing this. So dramatic figures are not real human beings. They behave differently than them. So some of the ways that they're different is they're artificially produced. They are not real people. They're not born with an organic will of their own. They actually are artificially produced and constructed, just like a chess piece in a game. They are designed to do certain things within the game of a play, right? So that means that they are functional rather than autonomous. So they don't just make choices of their own will. Everything they do in a play, a figure, it's determined in advance what they can be doing. That's determined by the playwright, and then they're given a little more freedom by the actor, but ultimately their function is set in the play. And then finally, people can transcend their limitations, but figures, again, like figures in a game of chess, they can't really be separated and exist in relationship to their environment and their feelings. They really are solely constituted in their entire being is constituted by their relationship to the environment of the play. So they can't have really will when it comes to things. They were designed by the playwright and by the actor to do certain things. They're not influenced by social conditions. Instead, they're defined by the function they serve. And what this ultimately means is that in order to understand a figure in its entirety, all you really have to do is understand that finite collection of material that's in the play, in the dramatic text, and in the performance that you see in front of you. Whereas human beings, like the amount of information that helps us understand a human being, that's infinite. Human beings can change. There's all kinds of complicated things that make the actions of human beings a total mystery. Very different than a figure in a play. And another really interesting little fact about figures is that their name can reveal something about their inner essence. And except for nicknames that are given to people once we know their inner essence, the names that we're born with don't really tell us about our inner essence. However, if you have a character and their name is Greed, then we all know that this is a character who is greedy. All right. So when we're looking at dramatic texts for analysis, there are two different levels of analysis that we're looking at. One is the deep level, the written text of the play. So that's like the play itself, the text, the script. If it's a movie, it's a screenplay, because there is actually a performance in a movie, and that's the performance that takes place in front of the camera. But the written text is the deep level. The surface level of a dramatic text is the performance. So the show, when you see the actors on the stage with the sets, that's the surface level. And this isn't to say that it's shallow. This is to say that this is just what we see on the surface when we see a performance. So let's talk about the deep level, the literary part of a dramatic text. All right. The deep level is where we have the words written on the page. We figure out what characters are talking. This is a little excerpt from Shakespeare's Macbeth, and there's a location, a desert place. We hear thunder and lightning. Enter three witches. So these characters come in. So basically what we have here is the blueprint for performance, but this performance could be done in a multitude of different ways. Just this little scene has been done in many different ways throughout history, and that's the surface level, bringing in extra details that aren't in the text, that are not in the deep level. So the surface level, that's the performance of the text in a live environment. So this has to do with the actors on the stage, the lights, the sounds, the costumes, the set. All of these physical elements are part of the surface level of a dramatic text. And the dramatic surface has several concrete elements. One is the figure. We talked about that already. Space. There's a fictional space, and then there's an actual space. So there's the set, there's where we actually are, so we're supposedly, let's say, in the USA in 1776, but in fact we're in the United States in the present time. Time includes not just what year we're in, but also the passing of time. So again, if we look at a piece like Hamilton, we see a huge portion of a person's life, but it's conveyed in a very short period of actual time. It's a long fictional time compressed into an actual performance time that is very short. And then there's the set. And all these objects, they are physically real, but they are fictional in the sense that they represent an alternate reality on the stage. They have their own life as objects in the fictional world we see on the play. So those are some of the basic concrete elements of dramatic surface. And then, of course, there's also sound and other types of visuals that we aren't even bringing into this yet. So there are three kinds of dramatic text analysis that you might do. One is a deep analysis, and that's the sort of analysis that you would do in an English class, where you really focus on the literary aspect of a dramatic text. And then there's the surface analysis, and the surface analysis is the analysis of the surface level of a dramatic text. So that's performance. So these two levels are there. Dual analysis is when you compare the deep level of a text to the surface level of the dramatic text, and you see if there are places where they sync up nicely, and also places where they seem to be disjointed, either by accident or on purpose. And these are three ways that you can analyze a dramatic text. So before moving forward, just to understand some of the history of how we understand dramatic literature, let's look at some old ideas about narrative versus dramatic literature. And I'm going to start here. There's a quote from Plato, from Plato's Republic, where he's talking about the narrative function in writing. So he says, then the narrative, he's talking about narrative writing, is the kind that that he was talking about the verse of Homer, the epic poetry of Homer. And he's saying that narrative writing partakes of both imitation and simple narration, but that there's a small portion of imitation in a long discourse. And what that means basically is that the majority of Homer's verse is written from the standpoint of Homer telling you the story. He is saying, so-and-so walked down the street, so-and-so got into a boat, so-and-so killed a cyclops. Those are the sorts of things that Homer might be talking about in his kind of narrative writing. So another word that's used to describe narrative storytelling is report. So what that means is the author's voice reports the story. It tells the story about the other characters, or rather, it tells the story about the figures in the play. So sometimes we have dialogue spoken directly from a figure, but this is usually preceded by a reportative phrase such as, Hamlet said, to be or not to be. You never hear Shakespeare say, Hamlet said. It's because Hamlet's on the stage and he's just saying to be or not to be. That's not report. That's something else, and we'll go into that in a minute. And then narrative literature has a mediating or epic communication system. And that's the author's voice, the author's ability to take us back and forth in time, the author's ability to tell us what's happening inside the mind of a character. These are really powerful modes of communication that makes narrative writing and also filmmaking, honestly, because you can do this in film as well. It makes them very, very flexible in a way that is not as easy for theater or dramatic literature. So the term epic, by the way, refers also to narrative. So it refers to a form of storytelling that reports details indirectly to the reader and the audience rather than have them directly represented to the audience in real time. And then Plato goes on and he speaks. Actually, it's kind of funny if you read Plato's book 3. It's kind of worth reading, I think. But Plato's book 3, he sort of disapprovingly says that the other kind of writing is the type that will attempt, in the presence of many, to imitate all things, including claps of thunder, the noise of wind and hail, and axles and pulleys and trumpets and flutes and panpipes and the cries of dogs, sheep, and birds. And so it depends wholly on imitation in voice and gesture. And there's very little pure narration inside of a dramatic form of literature. He thought that was very unseemly to imitate all those things. But we like it because theater is very entertaining. We're not quite as strict as Plato was about these things. So dramatic representation occurs when performers and artists, and so this is representation as opposed to report. We have dramatic representation in language, and we have narrative report in language. So dramatic representation occurs when the performers and the artist imitate the words, sounds, actions, and appearances of any figures in the story. And so the performers speak as if they actually are the figures in the story being told. So unlike narrative, epic texts, mediating communication systems are an exception rather than the norm in a dramatic text. They are not a normal thing to see. Normally what we see is Hamlet standing on the stage being Hamlet. That's not narrative, that's not report, that is representation. Also, dramatic texts are absolute. They take the form of an independent world that exists in front of us and outside of us, and the world of the audience watches those figures in that play walking around. And I do want to apologize because I'm saying that I wrote characters out of habit through many of this, but anywhere you see character in here, just realize that I really mean figure when I say that, and I'll go back and change that later. Narration versus dramatic literature. Let's talk about audience reception. So narrative texts are meant to be received by an audience by listening. So usually there's a single storyteller telling the narrative text, and the audience receives that text by listening. And the deep level of a dramatic text is meant to be received by the audience via the surface level. So playwrights don't usually want audiences to just read their plays. They want to see them performed. So that's a big difference between the narrative and the dramatic literature, because the dramatic literature is meant to be delivered to the audience in a live performance, not to be read or heard aloud by one person. It's meant to be fully performed. And so when I say audience reception or mode of audience reception, I'm talking about the manner in which an art is experienced or expected to be experienced by a spectating, reading, or listening audience. So each author writing in their particular type of literature expects the audience to receive their work in a certain way. And as I've said, in dramatic literature, that way is via live performance. So this is just a picture of a couple of ways that narrative text are received. Here on the left there you see you see a storyteller telling a story to children. On the other side you see a book, because that is an audience member receiving the text in written forms. Here are a couple of pictures of dramatic text being received in the traditional way. Groups of people watching actors on a stage, costumes, there's a set over there on the left, but the relationship between the audience and the performers, that defines really, in most cases, the intention of a dramatic text when it's written as far as audience reception is concerned. This is how it's meant to be received. So, this brings us to the axes of dramatic text. So axes, think of axes as a grid, a line, two lines, one X and Y, right? And so one line is the axis of fiction. Let's say fiction is going this way, and then the other line is the axis of reality going down this way. And let's say that there's a point of intersection where the axis of fiction and the axis of reality meet. That is where dramatic performance happens. That is the place of audience reception, is when the axes of fiction and the axes of the real world meet, because the audience is in the real world, the theater space is in the real world, but then the fictitious figures and the environment are represented on the play, on the stage in performance. So there it is. There's a little drawing of that. Dramatic text in performance occurs right here in this intersection between fiction and reality. That's where your live performance is when it happens. So let's talk about performance versus theater, because this is also important for thinking about dramatic analysis. Performance is just the doing of an activity by an individual or group for the pleasure of another individual or group. So that could be singing a song, that could be dancing, that could be stand-up comedy, that could be just standing there and looking pretty. It could be all kinds of things, you know. But it's all about doing an activity for the pleasure of another individual or group. And then theater is different, because theater is a form of performance in which there is a fictional axis or a fictional story superimposed upon the axis of the real world by a multimedial performance. Now, when I say multimedial, I'm talking about the combination of things that are required in order to tell the dramatic story in a live performance. So we have actors, we have sets, costumes, sound effects, alteration and manipulation of perception of time and space. All of these things are superimposed on the real world in order to tell a fictional story in dramatic performance. Here are some entertaining examples of plain performance. On the left is elephant polo, which is my favorite sport. And on the right are some Shriners and little cars, which is my favorite parade thing. I don't know what you'd call that. I guess parade spectacle, I guess. Anyway, love the guys in the cars, but these are performance. We are not characters. We are actual human beings doing something for the entertainment of other people as the human beings we are. Theater, on the other hand, has a fiction superimposed on it. Here are two people, two actors pretending to be figures in a play. They are inside of a fictional set with fictional things in it. There, though, is a crossover between the real world and the imaginary, the fictional world here, in the sense that those two actors are real people. Those physical objects on the stage are real things. The light lighting the stage is real light, but it's all artificially manipulated in order to give the impression of another reality that we're peering into, and that's the excitement and the beauty of a theatrical performance. There are 5 channels of performance reception by the audience. So as I said before, theater is multimedial. We don't need to go into that more, but except to say that it uses a bunch of different visual, written, spoken, audio cues and symbols to communicate. And then there are 5 channels of reception. The 5 channels of reception are nothing more than the 5 senses. And the 2 dominant channels of reception by which human beings receive dramatic performances are the senses of sight and hearing, though there are some strange instances in which people have even used the senses of touch, taste, and, believe it or not, smell in order to make a performance interesting. And then the audience synthesizes this performing into meaning. They receive the performance through their various channels, and they create meaning by synthesizing all those things together into a complete whole within themselves. So there they are, the 5 channels of audience reception. There they are. Let's talk a little bit more about the deep level, the play. All right. For the purpose of analysis, you can think of 2 different texts that exist within a written play. One is the primary text, that's the spoken dialogue of the dramatic figures. So when the figures speak to each other or in monologues, that's the primary text. And then there's a secondary text, which ultimately means everything else that's not dialogue or monologue. So secondary text is there are verbal parts of the text that aren't excuse me. There are verbal parts of the literary text that are not reproduced on stage in spoken form. The title, right? That's not necessarily reproduced. Sometimes it is, but it's always kind of cheesy when that happens, right? You know, like we have a play called The Bad Day, and then one of the actors looks at the stage and says, "We're indeed having a bad day." That always seems kind of cheesy to me when they say the title, but it can be funny. And then we have inscriptions. Like this play is dedicated to dedications, prefaces, a preface where the author is trying to give us some idea of why they wrote this play, which may or may not be insightful, but sometimes it is very insightful. George Bernard Shaw writes some amazing prefaces. Sometimes they have barely anything to do with his play, but they're wonderful reads. Dramatis Personae, that is the cast, right? That's just the actors in the stage. I don't know why I did not put an E and then an F and a G, but let's move on to the next one. Act and scene announcements. Those are ways that we divide up the play so that we can understand it as segmentations of different parts of the play. It helps for directing and for acting. Stage directions, that's when we are told what to do on the stage, so John walks across the stage. That's a stage direction. And then identification of speaking figures. So that's like when you see John's name in print and then you see his dialogue next to it, that's part of the secondary text. So these are 2 things that you can analyze when you're analyzing a dramatic text. There are 4 kinds of dramatic structure. There are more than 4 kinds of dramatic structure, but these are 4 basic kinds of dramatic structure. And if you look on the website, you'll see that I've created a section of the website on the left, a tab that just says plays. And if you go in the plays are divided into these 4 structures. And you are not required to write anything about these plays, but you are strongly, because we mostly will be working with excerpts and things like that in this play, in this class, but you are strongly recommended to read the examples of the plays that are in there. You will be reading some of them, but not all of them. Anyway, so there are 4 kinds. There's plot-driven, or what's called Aristotelian, because it's named after Aristotle. Plot-driven or Aristotelian dramatic structure. Central self dramatic structure. Epic dramatic structure. And cyclical dramatic structure. Or maybe it's pronounced cyclical. I've always said cyclical. But these are the 4 types of dramatic structure, right? Let's look at plot-driven dramatic structure. This is your traditional dramatic structure that most of you are familiar with, and it's the most dramatic structure not only in theater, but also in film, when you watch film. So, starts with an introduction, or an exposition that presents the initial conflict and also gives us information on the background, what happened before the play started. There's an exciting force, also sometimes called an intrusion, and that is a decisive action by a protagonist or an antagonist that makes the conflict in the play happen. So exciting force makes the conflict in the play happen. It can be brought in by something else, by other than a protagonist or an antagonist. Like, for instance, if there's a giant earthquake and that causes a problem. So it can be nature causes something. But usually in a play, a protagonist or an antagonist creates conflict by taking a decisive action at the beginning of the play that upsets the balance of the world of the play that's established in the introduction. And then rising movement, so we have a series of actions and events that lead towards a climax, and the climax is the height of conflict. It's the final conflict. And then there's a tragic force, and that initiates a protagonist's downfall, or at least a decisive change in a plot. Now, I say tragic force here because we're essentially talking about tragedy, because we're talking about Aristotle, and that's what he talked about. But tragic force could also be comic force, because it could lead to a protagonist's success. And that would essentially be called, in Aristotle's mind, a comic force. But it could also be called a positive force or a negative force. Just understand, a climax can end for good or for ill for the protagonist or the antagonist. And then we have fall actions, which are, this is like loose ends getting tied up. I'm sorry, fall actions are not loose ends getting tied up. They are the actions or events that follow a tragic force, in particular, where we see the slow demise of somebody. It could be the protagonist or the antagonist, and we know something really bad is coming. And then, right before everything blows up at the end, or right before everything gets really good at the end, depending on if you're watching something that's tragic or comic, there is a delay. Something happens to delay, and that delay really just creates suspense. Oh my gosh, we sit there wondering what is going to happen when this catastrophe takes place, or what's going to happen when everything gets really, really, really good all of a sudden. And then finally we have the ending, which is the catastrophe itself. So like in a play like Oedipus, Jocasta hangs herself, and Oedipus comes out, and he's gouged his eyes out, and then that's basically the way it works. And if you look down there, I said the ancient Greek tragedy Oedipus is the prime example, and that's a play we'll be looking at in this class. But it is a prime example of this kind of dramatic structure. Then there's central self dramatic structure. So central self dramatic structure is also called journey play, and almost everything in the play, in a central self play, is to reveal something about the central self character of the play. So usually in such a play you have short scenes alternating with long and complex scenes. You have scenes in the open air with intimate interiors. You have soliloquies with crowd scenes, often people talking to the crowd. You have, so it's an alternation, by the way, of open air and intimate interiors on number B there. I wanted to clarify that for you. There's a combination of open air and intimate scenes usually. Soliloquies with crowd are alternated with crowd scenes. Dynamic stage action alternates with static stillness, and emotional pathos alternates with ironic deflation. The unifying element of a central self play is a character that appears in most scenes and seems to move through a sort of journey throughout the play. So I guess I could have written this slide better, but all those A through E, what they're indicating are alternations of opposites, short scenes with long scenes. Open air scenes alternating with interior scenes. Soliloquies with crowd scenes, so monologues and lots of dialogue with lots of people on stage. Lots of exciting stage action alternating with static stillness. Emotional pathos alternating with kind of ironic deflation, so it's not so emotional. And then all of this is that unifies this is the character, but there is alternation of opposites in it. An example of this is the morality play, the medieval morality play, Everyman. Again, this is a play that we'll be looking at in this class in order to get a view of these dramatic structures. Epic dramatic structure. Okay, so epic dramatic structure is very unusual for drama because it doesn't follow a lot of the normal rules of theater. It starts to break away. So, for one thing, cause and effect kind of crumbles in epic dramatic structure. Individual scenes can be pretty much independent of one another. They don't necessarily have to have a cause and effect. Scene A doesn't have to lead to scene B at all in an epic dramatic structure play. The plot process is more important than the end of the play. So getting to the end of the play, the process of getting to that end is more important and more dramatic than the end itself. It's not like Oedipus, where you have this really tragic picture of Oedipus with his eyes out and his children around him. It can end on a really pretty quiet note. It can be almost anticlimactic, but that anticlimactic moment brings to mind all the things that led to it. And that is kind of where the drama is all the things that led to that end. It's just important that you have an end in an epic dramatic structure. It is not important that the end moment be particularly dramatic, because the process of getting there is dramatic. I think I've flogged that horse. Okay, so we'll move on. So scenes, number 4, are sharply contrasted with each other in epic dramatic scene. And this causes the audience to compare the scenes as they go along. And so the audience tends to be more emotionally distanced from the action of the play in an epic dramatic structure. And because of this, they can ask questions like, why did that person do that? Rather than going, oh, boo-hoo, how terrible that this happened to this wonderful person. So epic structure invites us to be thoughtful about how figures do things and why figures do things and think things. And in a dramatic play like Oedipus, we more or less know what's coming at the end. And in even a play like Everyman, we more or less know it's got to go one of two ways at the end. Whereas in an epic play, the ending seems open to change, and what we think it's going to be changes pretty often while we're watching it in some cases. So that we don't really know necessarily where the play is going. So the plot can meander around and be a bit vague, and that's part of the pleasure of this kind of play. And we'll be reading The Measures Taken, which is a very short play by Bertolt Brecht, who his epic theater theory is one of the most influential theater theories, and it still remains very influential to this day. So cyclical dramatic structure. This one totally breaks the rules. I mean, there can be no plot whatsoever in a cyclical play. The primary thing about it is time moves in a circle. Time and events move from point A through a circuit of positions that don't necessarily relate in any way whatsoever, though they can, but often they do not relate. And then it can end either right back at the beginning at point A or at a corresponding position A1 at the end of the play or end of an act that is almost identical to the beginning. So it gives this idea of a cyclical pattern with no cause and effects and things just kind of moving in a repetitive way. It sort of reflects nature, but it also can be mechanical. And in this class, we'll be reading the cyclical play Waiting for Godot, which is an example of that kind of a structure. And Waiting for Godot does that in order to show how difficult it is for humans to communicate with and each other, and how difficult it is to make sense of the world. Also, let's talk about dramatic communication systems. Dramatic communication systems. There are two kinds. There's an external communication system. That's the communication between the playwright and you. So, for example, playwrights can communicate with us after they die via performance. It's really amazing. So, Shakespeare, we've all listened to Shakespeare because he wrote these plays, and most of us have probably read or seen at least part of Shakespeare's work. And in that moment, he's still communicating with you. He's just communicating with you through a text or through a mediated performance given to you by other artists in the theater. And then there's an internal communication system. In Shakespeare's play, there are a bunch of figures talking to each other. Now, every now and then they break the rules and address the audience, like in a prologue or an epilogue, but for the most part, they only speak to each other and act like the audience isn't there. And that is because they are in an internal communication system within that play, within that dramatic text, in the surface level, communicating with each other, not communicating directly to the audience. And even in the written text, in the deep level, they speak to each other for the most part. But this internal communication system between figures in the play is what completes the external communication between the playwright and the audience, because this sends the transmission from the playwright to the audience by the 5 channels, our senses. There are epic or mediated communication systems in dramatic text, and these always represent a deviation from dramatic normalcy, from that rule of dramatic representation as opposed to narrative report. So what we have are a chorus. When we see a chorus, that is usually a group of actors speaking to us directly as an audience member. Songs are sung, that communicates things directly to the audience. Allegorical characters who tell the audience, hey, I am greed. That is an epic, that is a report situation being reported to the audience. Word scenery, when people describe, oh, here we are inside of this great big castle, that is epic. Asides and soliloquies, so monologues to the audience, or when an actor turns and delivers a line to the audience in an aside, that is epic, that is mediated. Sometimes Brecht would drop down placards that would say, we are now in Paris in 1859, so that the audience could read them during a performance. That is a narrative, an epic mediated communication system. And these things serve, they replace the narrative voice that is so effective in novels and in films, and it gives some more flexibility to theatrical performance. But the most important thing to realize is that in addition to these functions, these are deviations from what most people consider normal. What we should learn from that is normal is not always best, right? A lot of times it's best to experiment, and then we can do things in a more effective and powerful way in drama. Here are some things that I think you might think about reading. Well, thanks for sitting through my lecture. And I do have a copy of this slideshow up on the course website in the weekly module.